Hi, and welcome to another session, Searching for Answers, the program where we dig into the Word of God in an attempt to get a handle on how it came together and meant in its original contexts and what it means for us today. We have a good panel together, as usual this time. I'll give the discussants a chance to introduce themselves. You grab your Bibles, and we'll get into the book of Esther.
Leo Ranzelin, School of Religion, Loma Linda University.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Webster, pastor at the Redlands Seventh Adventist Church.
And John Jones, La Sierra University. We're in the Old Testament now. For a long time, we spent most of our time in the New Testament, but we're kind of breaking over into the Hebraic text here now. Looking these days at the book of Esther, fascinating story with all of the glamour and the heartache that a good story can bring to bear. But a good story always also has two sides. And so we're getting into the clear emergence of two sides to this story now. We've had a chance to think about how this Jewish girl in the land of Mesopotamia has made her way up into the core of power as the queen, actually, of Xerxes or Ahasuerus. And now she has to make some deeply heart-searching decisions about how she's going to relate to the position that she occupies and to the political problems that are beginning to arise in the country of her adoption. And so here we are. She is Jewish, but not many people know it. But that is soon going to have to change. So we're coming down to chapter 4 now, and you remember that Mordecai, her uncle, kind of hangs around the king's court. He is Jewish, openly so, but she has kept her Jewishness under wraps. Nonetheless, she and he, her uncle and his cousin, are in contact with each other through messengers, one way and another. And the plot is thickening here because Haman, the number 2 person in power in the empire, has persuaded the king to decree a genocide, actually, against the Jewish people. That much is now in place. So we pick up with chapter 4, and Rochelle, get us into the story a little bit. Take us down, well, at least through the first 3 verses anyway.
I'm reading from the New King James Version, and Esther 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes.
Whoa. This thing's triggering a prompt response, isn't it? I don't know. What do you think, Rochelle?
It's not surprising.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's a decree throughout the empire, which was massive, that on this certain day, all your neighbors are able to pick up arms and are commanded to kill you. I mean, we've had a couple in our lifetime examples of genocide, and genocide being instigated by people talking over. I mean, I'm thinking of the Rwandan genocide right now. But to have a decree from your ruler to say that all your neighbors, everyone around you, is allowed on this day to kill you and take all your possessions. I mean, what does living? I mean, what do you do other than tear your clothes and mourn in the days leading up to this date. I mean, literally, you have the day and the hour of your death decreed.
It's unthinkable, unspeakable. It's the ultimate betrayal, isn't it? Your neighbors.
Right.
Indeed, families with whom you may be, in some cases, intermarried. It's horrific, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Mordecai is not going to let this pass unnoticed. He's not going to sneak off and hide in some cave. He places his neck on the line from the word go here, doesn't he? He's out there in the most public place he can go, as far toward the king's palace as he is allowed to go in sackcloth and ashes. He can't go any closer. But this is clearly in the thoroughfare of Shushan, of Susa, and he is going to make his point, isn't he?
Yeah. One of the things that perhaps we might want to add here to this first part of chapter 4 is that in the previous chapter, the lots were cast during the month of Nisan, which is the first month of the Jewish calendar in which Passover is celebrated. Passover is a festival that celebrates the Exodus and God's deliverance of Israel from the bondage of slavery. And the Persian postal system was quite good, so I imagine when these letters went forth to the whole empire, we may well be still in Nisan here, when instead of celebrating Passover, they are in deep, deep mourning. And the irony of that in a terrible way really comes through here, doesn't it? The other aspect of these verses that Rochelle just read is great mourning, fasting, weeping, and lamenting. And so here we come across one of our first dilemmas as to whether this is an appeal for divine aid or not. Because in other portions of the Hebrew Bible, when fasting takes place, oftentimes the object of that is God. So
God is the referent here, even though unnamed.
Is that the case, even though he's unnamed? Right?
Interesting, huh?
Yeah. So many pieces of that, right? Fasting, weeping, lamenting, mourning. Where's prayer and where's God? I can't help but think that that's a piece of this. Divine providence and ask for help.
Right. I mean, also, isn't the tearing of the clothes and the sackcloth not only mourning, but isn't it a sign of repentance or a sign of, I mean, they all seemed to be tied together in the prophetic texts. If a prophet is about to prophesy, there's often the fasting and the mourning, but there's the tearing of the clothes as a sign of distress, but also it's connected in some ways to this call for something to turn around. A turning around of some sort. So. So this is a quick response. Mordecai is a case in point, but it's the whole Jewish people, isn't it? And they're just stunned by this, obviously.
And what a contrast that Haman and the king are feasting, and celebrating, right? And the very next story is of deep mourning and lament. Juxtaposition.
Horrific business.
Two emotions.
So now we move inside again. One of the interesting literary qualities of Esther is that the scene shifts back and forth between inside and outside of the palace, the harem, and the quarters. And so now with verse 4 of chapter 4 in Esther, we move inside, don't we? So I'll let you take us down through a little further. Since we've got you reading this, Rochelle, you carry it forward for us down through verse 8, and let's see what happens.
Verse 8 or to 9?
Either way.
Okay.
My paragraph in New Revised Standard Version breaks between 8 and 9, but you do it wherever you want.
All right. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the city's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan or Susa, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go in to the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai.
Yeah. Mordecai knows a thing or two, doesn't he? He knows the amount of the bribe that Haman offered. He could only know that from Esther, surely. Now, the interesting thing is she knew. Yeah?
And yet it's interesting, in the verse 4 and 5, she seems to be isolated.
Right. I was thinking.
Part of the royal court, and it seems to me unaware of the edict of extermination of the Jews.
Or something, yeah.
Right.
Now, I don't know. If this is, we have a little daylight opening up between Esther and her uncle here.
Right.
Come on, uncle, don't do this. You're embarrassing me.
Right.
And so get decent. You know, you can't even come in here unless you get something on you.
But if she had known about the decree, I think she would have figured the warning is obviously related to that.
Why he's doing that.
But you're right.
So I don't know.
The other thing that I'm struck with here is Esther now begins, I think, her transformation, right?
Yeah.
Earlier on, there's this reference in chapter 2, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Now she started to take the initiative, to be more proactive, and to be a more full-orbed character in the story.
Yeah. And she's going to have to make some decisions on her own here, isn't she?
Pretty soon she's going to be commanding him, and Mordecai is going to be following through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's some question marks about how much she knows here, but I could imagine that as part of the woman's court, that she was quite removed from any conversations, many political conversations. I mean, she has maids and eunuchs, and there's, you know, we wonder just what type of conversations they were able to have, but there is this outside, there's weeping and wailing, and inside it feels isolated or insulated, and just again to bring this to leap contexts and years forward, but how often are we isolated or insulated from the weeping and the wailing and the sorrow that is happening outside our walls?
We cushion ourselves.
We cushion ourselves. Again, it's leaping from context, but I do feel that there's in this story somebody who's living inside the cushioned walls.
Yeah.
And I do think it gets played out. She wonders what she's going to do with that. She feels safe in the palace, in part, at least. And it is comfortable. And she's somewhat removed from the wailing.
She could wash her hands.
Which leads me, I mean, in my interpretation, I kind of believe that she doesn't really know. So she's removed, and she doesn't know, and it's far away, and it would be easier just to not think about it. And then she is reminded or told, and at first, as you said, it's brought to her attention through a kind of an embarrassing act that Mordecai is doing. Right. Come on, put some clothes on. Why are you embarrassing me? And then she's faced with, what do I do?
Well, I've got to acknowledge, I think you're both right. Verse 5, she sends for Hathach to go out there and find out what's going on. So it may very well be, excuse me, that I attributed more knowledge to Esther than we're to think of her as having. She may not. And I'll admit, why would the king bother to tell her? He's busy drinking with Haman.
Right.
He's not accountable to her. He doesn't know she's Jewish, apparently. So, yeah, I need to backtrack a little on that, I think. Leo, can you get us down to the end of the chapter? And then let's pause and see where we are.
Okay. So, verse 10 and following, right?
Yeah.
Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone, may that person live. I myself have not been called to come in to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
Okay, so who's in charge now?
Exactly. What a change, huh?
Who's giving orders to whom?
Right.
Here is the closest hint of the divine.
Right.
Who knows? But you came to the kingdom for
Right.
such a time as this. It is an allusion to divine providence, I think.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
And also, right before then, if you remain silent,
Yeah.
relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from
Yes.
another place.
There's divine providence on another level. Yeah. Right. That's right.
And so what this story brings to light is the interplay between human freedom and divine providence. And oftentimes in so many places the accent is upon divine providence, but here the motif is clearly on human freedom, these free moral agents making decisions which God is able to utilize to bring about the deliverance of the Jews. Remarkable interplay for me,
Yeah.
and where the emphasis lies.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Gospels, where in the Gospels you have these, and I think all four, references to divine providence with references to Scripture and fulfillment formulas. And yet there you see the treachery of the religious leaders, right? The crowds initially excited about Jesus, eventually become indifferent and then turn. The disciples befuddled and perplexed, trying to figure out who the Jesus of Nazareth is. Is he truly Israel's Messiah? Through all that, somehow, some way, God's plan of salvation is fulfilled in the death and resurrection of Jesus. You know, that interplay between divine providence and human freedom, I've always been struck by. And I think I see it here as well in this book of Esther, with the emphasis, as I said, on human freedom.
Yeah. There are two ways Esther can perish, which is what really brings her to the decision point. She can try to outsmart everybody and just ride this tide and survive it. But there's a very real possibility that she could perish as a Jew among her fellow people. That's one way.
Right.
The other, of course, is she could also perish by bending the rules. I suppose that regulation was to fend off assassination attempts. You know, you can't come into the presence of the ruler unless he himself takes the initiative to invite you, and he will only invite people he trusts, obviously. So I think that's the rationale behind that. But it works against Esther, wishing to get the ruler's ear. She's skirting. She's on thin ice here. And she is saying, if I perish, I perish.
You were saying that there's two ways that she might perish, but I was thinking, with this individual and community motif, that even if she were to survive physically, but all the other Jews were to die, she would still die as a Jew.
Yes.
I mean, her
right.
people would have died.
Yeah.
And so there's, I mean, this whole conversation about how do we relate in the wider culture, how are we supposed to integrate or not integrate? I mean, there's something so meaningful to me in these words in Esther, in chapter 4, this moment of decision. There's moments that we come to where the stakes are too high to remain silent, and we do not know what the consequences of our actions will be, and yet, if I perish, I perish. I mean, it is, I have to act. I must do something here.
You can't duck this.
I cannot, What are those moments in our lives where we say, I cannot remain silent? I mean, I think of the prophet Jeremiah, I cannot, like there's a fire burning in me, and I cannot keep silent. It's a profound moment for this young woman to say, this is my moment. I have no idea what the consequences are going to be, but I must act. There comes a moment in our lives.
Yes, and not to act is to act, in a certain sense. But indeed, there's the real potential for losing her essential being.
Exactly.
And all that she's really about in this world.
Right.
Nicely put.
What is she in this kingdom for? What is she in this world for? She has to face up to that now.
Right.
In a new way.
Right.
Before she gets to that point, I think we need to appreciate her reflections and deliberations as she thinks about the situation that she finds herself into. Because there Mordecai in verse 8 charges her, right? You've got to go to the king. We need help. You need to entreat him to deliver your people. And she, in essence, says, no, I won't go. She's aware of etiquette and Persian customs and the laws and regulations. I just can't waltz in there and expect to be delivered by the king. You just can't do that unless a scepter is put out. And moreover, my relationship with the king doesn't seem to be the best of late, because a month has passed and he's not even thought of me, hasn't called me. So her situation with the king is precarious, right? She's aware of these customs and laws. And yet Mordecai comes back, but you need to think of this a little more carefully, right? The situation that you're in. And further reflection lead her to realize, I need to act, as you've nicely said. This is a situation at a point in time when I cannot not act. And so she calls, as we know, for the fasting for 3 days. And then I will go in there, even though, as she says, it's against the law.
And to circle back to our questions of the hints of God, or the hints of faith in this book, why would she be fasting? And why would she be fasting for 3 days? What is
serious.
the purpose of that? And in the Jewish faith, the purpose of fasting for 3 days is prayer.
Right.
I mean, it is a serious moment and a call for God's guidance. In all the other moments of fasting, it's fasting and prayer. In the other books that we read.
And to make a contemporary application is when we come across these moments in our lives that are incredibly serious, right? In which we're uncertain as to precisely how to act, or if I'm going to act in a certain way, I need to ask God for help. Here it's not just one day, but it's 3 days of fasting. And I think you're right, with prayer as well, asking for God to step in and lead and guide her to respond to this.
And remember, we spoke earlier about the fact that we got to this point because of so many moments of defiance, right? And this is another moment of defiance, but we got to the place with Vashti defying, and then we got to this moment is because Mordecai defied, and it doesn't say in either of those two defiances whether they fasted beforehand.
Right.
And now here she's going to defy a decree again, and in this moment she is pausing to fast. And so there's a complicated consequences around standing up for yourself. Standing up for yourself with Vashti sets and range emotion. Standing up for yourself and Mordecai with Mordecai causes a domino effect. But it's not a blanket statement that you should never defy. You should always obey, right? Because in this moment, it is her defiance of the king's law that leads to her people being saved. But she fasts beforehand. She takes it seriously.
That's well said. It's an important point, and I think it raises for us, on a double level, the question, what would be the function of this text? As Jewish people later, centuries even later, read the story, and what does it do for us today? Leo, I think you had something going a second ago.
I just wanted to elaborate on the point you've made, because when you look at the deeds and the actions that we've seen heretofore, right? We've seen banquets, we've seen wine, we've seen Esther part of the harem of the king, and acts of disobedience. And we've come to this point, and we know what's coming. You know, we'll get to that at a future time. It seems to me, through all those actions of human beings, somehow, some way, the hidden providential hand of God is at work, bringing about his redemptive purposes for his people, which here is they're being persecuted, they want to destroy them. That cannot happen. I've got to save them. So through all that, God's in there. And I take comfort in that, knowing that sometimes things that I can't make sense of, I can look back and say, well, wow, I think God was at work.
Right. And only now do the contours begin to emerge here of where we're headed, don't they?
Right.
We wonder about this girl. She's a girl. She's a woman. She's a girl. She's female. That's already a marginalizing situation, as we've remarked before. But all the way along to chapter 4, we're not sure. We see how much she has immersed herself in that context. We're not sure about her. We as readers are not allowed to really know what she's made out of until now. Now we begin to see. The text functions that way for its ancient Jewish readers too. They too must have read, heard this story, and wondered. Now they begin to see. The text then speaks to our integrity, to our spinal columns, and to our faith on searching for answers.